They say that everything is remembered by Georgia's red soil. The footsteps, the screams, the whispered sins carried on humid winds through the moss-draped trees. But some stories were never meant to be unearthed. A man who believed bloodlines were destiny and that he could play God lived on a plantation outside Macon in 1838. He saw people not as souls, but as ingredients. He claimed to have discovered a way to build a perfect lineage, one born of control, cruelty, and obsession. His name was Silas Breckenridge, and deep in the graves behind his mansion his legacy was buried. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one that way. What you're about to hear isn't written in history books. It's pieced together from diaries locked away in attics, yellowed letters hidden behind walls, and confessions from descendants who swore they'd never speak. It's the story of a plantation master who forced enslaved men to breed with his own daughters. In pursuit of what he called a stronger bloodline, but behind the justifications, behind the twisted logic of a man drunk on his own power, lies something darker, a secret family experiment that destroyed every life it touched. Because in the antebellum South, sin was institutionalized, not just tolerated. And on the Breckenridge plantation, science was what sin became. So tonight, we dig into a story whispered only in genealogical circles. One that exposes how obsession with control, of race, of lineage, of destiny, turned his family into unwilling participants in a generational curse and a father into a monster. This is the story of Silas Breckenridge, the man who believed he could engineer blood itself, and the horrific legacy he left behind. The birth of an obsession. Silas Breckenridge was born in 1794 to a wealthy cotton dynasty carved from the bones of enslaved labor. His father Ephraim was known as a progressive thinker, the kind of man who quoted scripture while signing ledgers filled with human names. He taught his son early that strength could be bred like cattle or horses, but that purity of blood was a myth. By the time Silas inherited the estate in 1832, he had already absorbed the language of control. The plantation stretched over 2,000 acres, and more than 100 enslaved men and women toiled under his rule. But Silas wasn't satisfied with wealth or power. Legacy was what he wanted. He believed that the South was destined to fall because it clung to weakness and that he could forge a new people, stronger, more resilient, born from refined breeding. Silas wrote about his vision of blood alchemy in his journals, discovered decades later in a false wall behind the master bedroom. He described flesh as clay, lineages as experiments. He believed that by blending the intelligence and education of his own bloodline with the endurance of the enslaved, he could produce children untainted by frailty. He claimed God had chosen him to begin a reformation of man. Neighbors thought him eccentric but respected his intellect. He hosted salons where he quoted Aristotle and Galton long before eugenics had a name. He spoke of destiny, of biology as divine will. And behind closed doors, he began preparing his daughters not as children, but as vessels. Mary and Eliza were raised in silence and obedience. They were taught Latin, scripture, and the science of inheritance. They were forbidden from courting, from friendship, from even stepping beyond the estate's borders without permission. Silas made them recite verses about obedience and lineage in the family chapel. He told them their purpose was sacred, that they would bear children to redeem mankind's flaws. In the summer of 1838, Mary's purpose began, at the age of 17. Silas chose one of his strongest enslaved men, a blacksmith named Josiah, not as a husband, but as a subject. The act was not one of love or union, but ritualized violation masked as divine order. And the Breckenridge estate would never again be silent from that night forward. The House of Two Bloods. What happened after that night would haunt every corner of the Breckenridge estate. Servants whispered that Mary stopped speaking altogether. She drifted through the halls like a spirit, her eyes distant, her hands trembling whenever her father approached. In her hidden diary, found decades later beneath the loose floorboards of her room, she wrote, "He says I am chosen, but I feel unclean. He says God wills it, but I see only darkness. Silas called her pregnancy a triumph, a sign that his theory was working. He recorded every stage of her condition in meticulous notes, describing her swelling belly as if it were a scientific project, not a living soul. When the child was born, a boy with dark skin and hazel eyes, Nathaniel was the name Silas gave him, a name meaning gift of God. But beside it in the ledger, he wrote, Specimen 1. Eliza, the younger sister, watched in horror. She begged to be spared, but Silas reminded her that their divine purpose was obedience. She too was forced into the same fate within months, paired with another enslaved man, Samuel, known for his height and strength. Eliza's letters, discovered in a trunk in 1912, revealed the torment of a young woman caught between faith and revulsion. If this is God's will, she wrote, then I have no God at all. The enslaved men chosen for Silas's experiments carried their own pain, trapped between complicity and punishment, powerless to refuse. Josiah the blacksmith carved a message into the wall of his workshop, "We are all prisoners of one man's madness." It would remain faint but legible there until the building rotted away a century later. Silas treated the resulting children like living evidence. He measured their limbs, recorded their illnesses, and compared their features to sketches in his notebooks. He told his daughters that one day their blended offspring would inherit a new world, a nation reborn through superior blood, and that their suffering was necessary. But beneath his arrogance, the plantation was beginning to rot. Shadows gathered in the corners of the halls, crops failed, workers fled, and the children born of Silas's obsession grew up between two worlds, cursed by both, belonging to neither. And as they grew, something else began to happen. The specimens did not become what Silas promised. Instead, they became mirrors, reflecting the horror of a father who believed he could rewrite creation. The rebellion of the soil. By the early 1840s, a place of whispers and ghosts was what the Breckenridge plantation was. The locals avoided it, calling it the House of Two Bloods. Even among the enslaved communities, the name was spoken with fear. Unnatural things grew there, they said. Children marked by sorrow, women cursed by a father's pride. Mary's son, Nathaniel, grew quickly, strong and silent, his eyes filled with an intelligence far beyond his years. Yet he never smiled. Servants claimed he wandered the fields at night, humming hymns his mother never taught him. Eliza's daughter, Ruth, was pale-skinned, with hair like her mother's, but a gaze that unsettled even Silas himself. He called them proofs of progress, yet never touched them with affection. To him, flesh was turned into data, they were evidence. Mary, broken by the birth, grew ill. Her diary entries became incoherent, scribbled with trembling hands. She wrote of nightmares, of shadowed figures whispering from the woods, of voices crying from beneath the soil. In one final note before her death at 19, she confessed, "If my blood was his experiment, then may my soul be my rebellion." Eliza tried to protect Ruth, teaching her songs of freedom, hiding her in the quarters, telling her stories her father forbade. But Silas discovered the defiance and ordered Ruth brought into the main house. He began teaching the child Latin and scripture, calling her the bridge between races. But behind his lessons was a growing madness. He spoke of building an entire generation, a new breed to replace the Old South. Neighbors who once attended his salons now avoided him. Some claimed they heard screams in the night. Others swore they saw candlelight flickering in the attic, where Silas spent hours muttering to himself, surrounded by bones and ledgers. By 1845, the plantation's wealth had withered, debts mounted, crops failed, and rumors spread like wildfire. Yet Silas refused to relent. "Weakness is rebellion," he wrote in his journal. "The blood must be perfected. God does not ask permission." And then, as the world beyond his gates began to shift, whispers of abolition, rebellion, and divine justice, the house itself seemed to turn against him. Strange illnesses struck his children. Animals died without cause, and Silas began to dream of figures standing at his bedside, his daughters, pale and silent, holding the children he called specimens. His experiment, it seemed, was no longer his to control. The aftermath and legacy. By the winter of 1846, the Breckenridge estate stood half empty, its fields overgrown, its halls echoing with silence. What had once been a proud plantation now felt more like a monument to one man's obsession, a mausoleum. Silas wandered through the corridors, whispering to the ghosts of his daughters, clutching his journals. Mary was gone, buried beneath a willow tree with no name carved upon the stone. Eliza had vanished one stormy night, fleeing into the darkness toward rumors of freedom, taking Ruth with her. Those who remained told of strange happenings. Doors creaked open in the dead of night. The nursery where the children once slept filled with cold draughts and the scent of iron. The ledger books, Silas's sacred records, began to decay, ink bleeding into the pages like veins. Silas no longer wrote of blood alchemy. His notes became confessions, prayers, and ravings. I sought to build strength, one entry read, but I have built only sorrow. The Lord gave me daughters, and I made them vessels. Now their eyes haunt me. Their blood stains my hands. The surviving children, Nathaniel and Ruth, were never seen again after 1847. Some claimed they were taken north by abolitionists. Others whispered that they died in the woods, victims of their father's curse. In the nearby town, people said they could still hear singing from the tree line on foggy nights. Two voices, one low and one high, harmonizing in sorrow. By 1850, Silas Breckenridge was found dead in his study, slumped over his desk, his final journal open before him. The blood remembers, the last line read. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. Would you bury the truth or confront it? Because the story doesn't end with Silas. Genealogists tracing Southern family trees uncovered inexplicable branches in the early 1900s. Descendants with no clear origins. Children recorded as unknown parentage born of both white and black ancestry tied back to the Breckenridge name. Some changed their surnames, others disappeared entirely. But the records don't lie. Unseen, unspoken, and unresolved, the legacy of Silas's experiment still flows somewhere in the tangled roots of American bloodlines. The unearthing. Decades turned into centuries, but the soil never forgot. When developers broke ground on the old Breckenridge property in the 1960s, they unearthed bones, small, fragile, and unmarked. Local authorities claimed they belonged to livestock. Yet the fragments of children's shoes and rosary beads told another story. The records vanished within weeks, sealed under private ownership. The land was sold quietly to a distant relative who refused interviews and sealed off access. But the truth had already begun to surface elsewhere. In whispered family stories passed down through generations, in the DNA results that didn't align, in the faces of descendants who carried two histories within their veins. A few brave enough to trace their lineage uncovered the Breckenridge name, buried under layers of shame. They spoke of inherited nightmares, visions of candlelit halls, the sound of crying in their sleep, and a shadowed figure standing at the edge of their beds. One descendant, a man from Savannah, confessed in a 1982 interview, "All my life, I've felt like something was watching me, something old. When I learned about Silas, it made sense. My grandmother used to say our blood was a curse, that we were born from sin and science." Historians dismissed these accounts as folklore. Southern Gothic tales spun from guilt and decay. But the paper trail told another story. Land deeds, baptism records, anonymous letters mailed to local archives. Each piece a fragment of a puzzle that formed a single horrifying truth. Silas Breckenridge had succeeded in blending bloodlines, but not in creating strength, only sorrow. His specimens were never monsters. They were children, innocent souls, burdened with a legacy they never chose. The true monster was the man who believed that destiny could be engineered with cruelty, that love could be replaced with calculation. And in that belief, Silas mirrored something far larger, a nation built on the illusion of control, convinced it could decide whose blood mattered. His story was not an outlier. It was a symptom, one that still echoes in quiet ways, in genealogical records, in family secrets, in the unspoken shame of mixed heritage hidden in plain sight. Because the past does not stay buried. It breathes in the blood. It hums in the bones. It lingers in the names we forget, the graves we don't mark, and the blood we carry without knowing. It waits for someone brave enough to listen. Today, the Breckenridge estate is gone, swallowed by forest and time. Yet the land still carries an unease, as if every scream, every prayer, every whispered vow of silence is remembered by the roots. Those who've walked the property say the air feels heavy, that the wind moves differently there, as though it's passing over the weight of untold stories. Modern historians rarely mention Silas Breckenridge by name. His journals are sealed in a private collection at a Georgia university, accessible only by special request. The official record calls him a progressive agriculturalist, erasing the horror he inflicted on his own family. But for those who know how to read between the lines, who trace the census records, who follow the bloodlines that suddenly split and vanish, the truth is unmistakable. Silas's legacy is not just a family curse. It is a mirror held up to America itself. A nation that built itself on control of land, of labor, of lineage, and told itself the ends would justify the means. His belief that he could perfect blood through forced union was not born in isolation. It echoed the philosophies that would later give rise to eugenics, segregation, and the unending myth of superiority. And yet, in the quiet tragedy of his daughters, in the innocence of the children born from his madness, there is something hauntingly human. The reminder that every attempt to play God ends not in power, but in ruin. Perhaps that is why the story was buried. Not to protect his name, but to protect the illusion that such things were rare. But the truth is that hidden experiments, unmarked graves, and families who will never know where they come from are what the soil of this country is thick with. So if you've ever felt a darkness in your ancestry, a silence around your name, or a story your elders refused to tell, remember this. The past is never truly past. It waits for someone brave enough to listen. And now you've heard it. If this story disturbed you, share it. Not to sensationalize, but to remember. Because only by uncovering what was hidden can we ever hope to heal what was broken.